Okay, so welcome back for this lunch keynote discussion. My name is Guntram Wolf, and I'm pleased to welcome today Robert Kroplewski, Plenipotentiary of the Minister of Digitalization for the Information Society and Minister of Ministry at the Ministry of Digital Affairs in Poland. Thank you very much for joining us today, and of course also Joachim Reiter, Group External Affairs Director at Vodafone. So what we plan to do today, thank you for being here. So what we plan to do today is to have each of you give a presentation, short presentation, how you would address the issue. So the issue being the overall issue of this conference, rethinking industrial policy in the digital age. What are the challenges for Europe? And once we've heard the two interventions, I will try to sort of moderate and ask you a few follow-up questions, but of course also make sure that you in the audience will have a chance to ask one or two questions to each of the two panelists. Robert, I think you're first, so thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your intervention.
I'm first. Thank you very much to be here for invitation and having very good and wisdom people in front of us. We have a chance to present the Polish state of digital challenging. Thank you for that. And maybe I try to create some points very important for our policy, but I think it's also very influential for European policy. And I think also that since 3 years of our government, we had some influence for changing of digital single market strategy. Yes, and 3 years ago we established that concept of Industry 4.0. It's not for Polish policy. Why? Because Industry 4.0 is only the digital copy of existing industrial relations. And we ordered special expertise of counting flowing of data in our country and how flowing of data create influence for our GDP and our micro economy. And it's shown that 46% of flowing of data has an influence of GDP. And it was a result not only for Poland, but also for Visegrad countries, and also for Germany, and also for France. That was a special expertise dedicated for Europe. That expertise was presented 2 years ago in Brussels. But for us, that was the first reason to think and create the special digital policy about data. It's that was a time of flowing of data, but for us that was sign that the data is last good asset. On that we could create the productivity. And we discover, and this is maybe a proposition for our previous panel today, that we discovered that nobody as an owner of data. Data is a copy of environment, but of course if we think about personal data, we have a different story. So of course we have a personal data like a type of ownership, but the share, if we share data on personal and non-personal, now we could see that only 10% of big box, it's only the personal data. The rest is industrial data, environmental data, and because of that, we still have a big asset for our productivity in Europe. If you think about rethinking industrial policy, it is Polish idea is like that. It's very important to create the special ecosystem of sharing of data. We called that system like virtual warehouses of data. This is a special club. We try to establish that idea among our entrepreneurs, our company. First, it was the state companies. Now we have new members. That is a special club when the member present data in the API interface, yes, and in the special open system inside, they could observe data, observe process and methodology of analyzing of data. And only the members of the club have a possibility of observing and analyzing the data. Other people, other companies who are outside of that club doesn't have a possibility. And why it's so tricky? Because we afraid about influence of giants, for example, coming from the maybe United States, but also from China and other countries. But that methodology is very open for them also. If they would like to be more open, they could present through API their system inside and present data, and because of that, the data from giants could be the part of our environment of data. We called that kind of system like a cyber trust ecosystem of data. Why that concept we promote inside of in our country, but also on the level of Europe and outside of Europe, because we discovered that without data, any company could fall down in the innovation depth. And finally, even giants fall down in the innovation depth. Why? What they do since maybe 15 years, they ask us about data, still every second ask us. Last goal in Europe, it's not maybe personal data now, but industrial data. And because of that, we are very in good moment that we could create a special ecosystem of sharing industrial data among the European entrepreneurs, yes, to create the very good environment of productivity and finally well-being of our citizens. And of course, it could be upper step, because we could promote that kind of idea outside of Europe. For example, we have a very like-minded country like Japan, lastly, yes, Singapore, also Canada, yes, they think the same. And last changing of maybe not policy yet, but consideration of policy in the United States about position of giants and the antitrust policy. Maybe it's a good time to talk with United States government to create the like-minded space of exchanging data and sharing data in that kind of model. This is like that. Maybe I take a step back. Why we try to launch that model? Because we believe that data it's not oil. Data it's the data like oil. It's a vintage concept. Because of industrial access, many things, especially if we think about Internet of Things. But if you think on that was our proposition. Data is like air. The artificial intelligence breathes air and exchange and give back the data like air, and that could create the special competition, not competition, environment for Europe. This is our beliefness, and we try to promote and create the asking offer for our alliance. Yes, this is from the beginning.
Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And let me ask you one follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned, and I thought that was quite impressive, that only 10% of the data are personal data, and the rest is industrial, all kinds of other data, including data that are entered into your smartphone when you ask questions and so on Google or whatever. And then you said that basically Poland is building, I think you called it a cyber ecosystem of data, or a cyber security ecosystem of data.
This is a cyber trust ecosystem.
A cyber trust. So can you say a few more words on how you created that? I mean, what did you do exactly, and how is the data managed? Who's in charge of this?
Now it's of course the laboratory concept. We check. Everything like in the special sandbox coming from the state, like I said before, and private. But we have two levels. The kind of club need to have a cybersecurity like regularly. We understand that situation and that environment, but trust is another level. Trust is it's not the cybersecurity, but the level of interoperability, the same interoperability, the same standards, and because of that, the members of the club could present the data. Nobody is able to download data. Yes, for that model, it is very enough to only have a possibility to observe data through the API interfaces, and the logic is like a labyrinth in the pyramid. You have many rooms. If you are the same kind of member, if you present from your company, for example, first step of openness, you have a possibility, the right to ask anybody for first step openness only, not more. And I think that finally that will be special agreement, for example, maybe the special code for how to could you share data. We try to launch that concept on not only in Poland, but we have a very basic experience and cooperation with the countries from Visegrad agreement, and also we try to promote that concept in the digital treaties initiative also.
Thank you very much. Now, Joachim, over to you. Rethinking industrial policy in the digital age. Where would you put your accent?
So I will try to cover 5 points, but the overarching message is one of scale, efficiency / frenemies, which goes to the heart of the previous speaker referred to, and finally good regulation. Vodafone's starting point into this is that we have not only recognized but also been fully plugged into a shift of the sector, in the sense that we're moving from what is viewed as telco being a sector to one which we call techcom, where you have the overlay of telecom and ICT, and then the plugging in of ICT, that new merged sector into the real economy. And that creates a lot of frictions, which I think we need to, as part of our industrial policy of rethink, we need to address. The first one is, of course, that whatever you put as a layer on top is that there are some enabling factors. You can't talk about digitization of the real economy in an effective way unless Europe addresses a number of enabling factors. First is, of course, the persistent infrastructure gap. Second is the skills gap, and third is the research and development gap. Now, I would say that Europe is quite well familiar with the latter two, in the sense of talking about skills gap and research and development, including with the multi-annual framework. What we're quite worried about is the lack of understanding of how to tackle the infrastructure gap, where you have to go back to basics, frankly. European telco is third year running the worst performing sector in Europe. We have price deflation equivalent to the Greek financial crisis annually. So there needs to be a fundamental understanding that if you want infrastructure, you need scale, and currently there's absolutely no scale economies in building the infrastructure that all the digital applications for the real economy will run on. So I think there's a lot of homework in that sense. Fundamentally, for me, it's about moving the needle on the capex portfolio of the industry. We have as an industry, we have lower return on capital than the cost of capital, which I wouldn't say this publicly, perhaps in that sense, but to be honest, you shouldn't run a business like that. When you borrow money from the bank and put it into an investment, and then the return on investment less than the cost of the borrowing of the money, it's really not a healthy situation to be in. So I think Europe needs to really step on the infrastructure part. That's one. And there's a lot to be done there. Europe did take a code which needs to be faithfully implemented, but it's far from moving the needle. Secondly is the question around data, which the previous speaker referred to, and I think it was a very good point on that it's like air. And we have to understand also, and Europe is a little bit stuck in the misunderstanding what's the difference between personal and non-personal data. The reality is that as we move into the 5G world, and when we talk about the convergence between the ICT sector, including telco, with the real economy, actually the real fuel or the real air is the machine-to-machine data. So a number of the regulations that we build up around personal data, all of which we support strongly and think are absolutely appropriate for Europe to have, it needs to think about the shift in a communication network that is no longer about people-to-people communication. And one of the things that was referred to here is data sharing. So data sharing will be absolutely crucial to Europe to find not a national way, but a European way of doing proper voluntary data sharing across sectors. There was a bank representative in the previous panel that referred to that as well. In other words, he's sharing data in one direction, but he's not getting it in the other direction. And it's a completely fair point to be said. We worked with Deloitte to actually put a price tag on that. If Europe had a proper framework for promoting voluntary data sharing, it would be equivalent to adding another Spain in terms of GDP to the European economy. So to forego that opportunity would not be a smart industrial policy tool for the Europe going forward. Of course, linked to that as well, we need to, as part of understanding the data, understand the value, for example, when we apply competition law and how we look at merger cases, which there's been some improvements in that direction, but for sure quite a lot more is needed. Third point is around platforms. There's a lot of discussions around platforms, but in the end, in this world of the merger of ICT with the real economy, you will find a number of actors being very, very powerful in terms of intermediaries or aggregators. Full disclosure, Vodafone is such a platform on IoT. We're Europe's largest IoT platforms on SIM connectivity. But we do think there is a genuine question to be asked around when platforms, there's a linear development in the platform space between being a platform, enabling people to actually have a marketplace, to one where you evolve into first being an ecosystem. And that's where you get to the question around bargaining power and the shift in the balance of power between those that are using the platform and those that are providing the platform. And then the final step in this journey is the closed garden situation, which, for example, is among one of the two operating systems. Now, if you just think about that, we cannot have a situation where competition law actually only kicks in after all the damage 10 years down the road has been put in place or has happened in the marketplace. The consequences for European economy and actually for the innovation, but also for all of those that the positives of platforms is undermined if we don't have a system of reacting much more quicker. That was one of the reasons why Vodafone, despite being a platform player as well, supported, for example, the platform-to-business regulation, including unfair commercial practices prohibition. Because we do think there needs to be some rules of the game because of the enormous bargaining power that you get when you devise platforms if you have a business plan to move them into closed gardens. The fourth point is on IoT. I have to be brutally honest here. Because of the misunderstanding of moving from people-to-people communication to machine-to-machine communication, and in that journey, the fact that we plug up things that are currently enjoying the free flow of goods within the European Union, one of the main achievements of the European Union as one of the four freedoms. The misunderstanding here is that people don't pay attention that all telco regulation is national still today in European Union. There is no single market for telco. So what does that imply when you put a SIM into a car? It means that actually the car in the past could be sold to a separate member state the day after. It can no longer be the case. You have to go to the telco regulator of that other EU member state, and you actually have to spend, in a concrete example, 9 months to get the car approved because the car is connected. So just imagine a situation where we start connecting everything. Are we on the verge of dismantling the internal market and the free flow of goods through the back door because we allow free flow of dumb products but not free flow of smart products? And of course, what happens when you merge something where you have an internal market with something which does not have an internal market is, unfortunately, the stickiest regulation applies. And unfortunately, the stickiest regulation is one defined by national boundaries still today. So I don't know why, but some member states still think it's a really smart idea that if you have a fire at home, you would run to your toaster and make an emergency call. Personally, I would use my phone rather than my toaster. But these type of conditions still exist because the journey of understanding what a 5G IoT will look like one driven by machine-to-machine data, not person-to-person communication, has not been done properly in Europe yet. So I think a big thing for the next Commission will be to develop a horizontal IoT policy regulation or framework that takes away the fragmentation that we otherwise run the risk of having for pretty much all connected goods that are flowing currently in Europe. The final point I wanted to mention is one of quality. There is a need for a discussion, a very genuine discussion, and it links to a number of the other previous points, but also my previous speaker referred to the question around security or trust. I think we as industry, as well as together with policymakers, needs to have a very frank discussion between ourselves whether the simplest focus until now of many policymakers, which has been price deflation, is the best measurement of a ubiquitous system where everything is connected. The minute you walk into a ubiquitous system where everything is connected, people should care a little bit more about security. And security is not for free. So that is one of the reasons why you have a big discussion in Europe around security today, including around one vendor. But the reality is that overall, Europe has underinvested in its cybersecurity capabilities, including to tackle cyber attacks. Overall, currently we have a system where if I sell a television set in Europe, I actually have to test it against European standards so it doesn't blow up and burn people's houses down. But I can sell a network equipment upon which you provide the ubiquitous system of 5G without actually having a standard to meet. And I would argue that networks, when it comes to the things that we actually build the entire society upon, we need to have a common understanding on the type of standards we expect. So that's one of the reasons why Vodafone has been very vocal over the last few weeks, arguing that the European Council, including that is meeting today, should actually kickstart a process to develop common security standards, testing and certification in Europe. Now, we're moving anyway to a software-defined product environment. So the journey that we're going to do with networks, which is basically predominant software-defined, is similar, by the way, to the car industry. Tesla is a computer on wheels. It can change the performance of the braking system by a software update. How do you run a type approval system in such a world? Europe needs to be able to answer these questions as we move forward, but do so with mindfulness around the quality that European consumers expect. And that is a trade-off. That means that Europe needs to end the perpetual cycle of purely injecting new artificial competition into a system which has destroyed the return on capital of investing in quality of networks or quality of services. And that's a really tough discussion that Europe's going to have over the next 3 to 4 years, where I hope it will get it right. But it is not the situation where we can continue having a 29% price deflation annually on the network and assume that people are going to be really happy investing in quality. Europe is going to get the networks it deserves, and what it deserves will be defined by its political choices. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of points on which to pick up and ask further questions. I guess one point where perhaps I want to push you a bit is this whole competition policy discussion, where it seems to me you have distinguished two different things. One is competition policy enforcement on the network, where you, I guess, believe that there is too much competition, therefore prices are falling too much. If I'm probably oversimplifying a bit, perhaps you can elaborate a bit on that. But then you mentioned, and I found that quite interesting, that competition policy and competition law can not only kick in ex post when it comes to platform regulation and platform competition supervision, where currently it's very strong ex post, but ex ante it's probably not very present. So when it comes to the design of the platform, so can you walk us a little bit through these two arguments of competition policy?
Sure. So on the first point, I'm not. I think it would be a mistake on both of these points, by the way, to put the whole burden on the strict instrument of competition law or competition policy. I think that's part of our message, is that if you look, for example, on the artificial creation of financially unsustainable actors in telco, injected, usually it's not by competition law that they were necessarily created. It's spectrum set-asides, which is a massive state subsidy basically to a new entrant, considering the price that everyone else has to pay in the market. And what usually happens is that they are sustainable for 3-4 years, destroy a massive amount of value in the sector, and then we have to buy them. And then we reset. And then the NRA does another spectrum set-aside, and we do this perpetual cycle of this. If you look at what we are arguing is you need to start to understand the value chain. Currently, we're operating in a value chain of a digital value chain where, for example, when I were around my 5G network, the current perception of the European policymakers is that it's great for Europe to have 200 plus operators, but there's no problem whatsoever. There's only 3 cloud providers worldwide, not even in Europe, worldwide. And all of these 200 operators are going to have to partner with the hyperscalers in cloud. And so you could just walk, if you think through the value chain, my problem here is not that we shouldn't have fierce competition. We should have absolutely fierce competition. We do not believe in Vodafone that a reduction of competition is the solution. The problem is the question on artificial state-sponsored injection for which there's no financial basis. That's the difference. And that's unfortunately what we see many times by telecom regulators, particularly in spectrum auctions, where it's played out visibly across Europe. And you have to ask yourself this question. When Europe is having half of US return on capital on infrastructure deployment, and US has 4 players competing across the entire market, and Europe has 200 plus players competing in individual small markets as opposed to competing fiercely across Europe because there's no scale economies in this sector. You have to ask yourself whether you have found the right magic bullet.
So the problem is lack of the problem is lack of integration of the market.
Exactly.
Right?
So the problem is lack
single market.
Absolutely, I think it's a single market issue. There's no one has figured out how to create scale economies and actually have a proper internal market with respect to telecommunications and infrastructure. And if you can't do that, you were operating basically in small markets. If you then, on top of it, have a perception on what's the perfect number in every of those markets, and that may well be justified. I'm not questioning. There's a perpetual discussion around 4 versus 3. I don't think that's really the issue. I think once you get moved into converged, proper infrastructure deployment through network sharing agreements, which the industry is going for now, de facto you're talking about 2 networks. There's no point in pulling 4 fiber lines into a home. You may have 2. But then it would be fierce in the service provision of that, in fierce competition, in selling to customers in the customer interface. But on the second thing, it goes to the same point. Don't place all the eggs in one basket, which is competition policy. I think actually, with respect to digital, the current Commission has stepped up significantly in terms of enforcement within the boundaries of its current approach. I think we do have to have a discussion, and Vestager has launched her consultation, which we think was very, very good that she launched that. We fed in our views on it. But our point is, and also our experience through negotiating with a number of other platforms that we rely on, is some basic ex-ante rules of the game are useful because it is an incredible bargaining power you get from platforms. You have a choice whether you want to be an open platform or a closed platform. We have, under our CEO, said very clearly we want to be an open platform to nurture that other people innovate on top of our platform, even if we didn't get part of the value. We see that as our scale opportunity, but it means that we have no problem whatsoever of actually setting some boundaries up front.
Well, there's many other issues we could pick up, but I do want to give you in the audience a chance to react, and I know that Scott from Bruegel would like to sort of ask one question, I suppose, on the infrastructure, which is much more a subject of his expertise and less of mine.
About 200 network operators across Europe. I certainly agree. Some consolidation would be healthy in Europe. Now, you operate across multiple member states, some 18, I think, a big number anyway. There's very few network operators that do, and an awful lot of the consolidation that's been attempted in recent years has been consolidation within member states. Mergers across member state boundaries would probably not be hard to get through. Is there any way basically to motivate other companies in the sector to do more of the consolidation that would help to build the scale that's needed?
Thank you. Let me collect a few comments and questions on the various points that were made. Please, Well, okay, one after the other, so please.
Hello, my name is Bert Heijk from BVA. You mentioned in your speech the operating system that is the walled garden. What could be done against this? I mean, this is the smaller operating system, smaller market, so maybe there is no market dominance or abuse, or what could be done against this situation?
Yeah, my name is Moni. I'm a European financial expert. A question to our colleague from Poland. We know that digital companies are very small, very fragile, and very vulnerable. They need desperately public support in order to grow up and in order to become also more efficient and more present on the globalized world economy. What is the experience in Poland? I mean, what is the state support that these digital companies are receiving in Poland, and how and to what extent the European financial support to Poland through regional funds or cohesion funds, etc., are directed towards the digital industry in order to make it more efficient, more robust, and more integrated, globally speaking. Thank you.
So I can take two more questions. Anybody in the back? Ideally a woman. Yeah, not very gender balanced here. Okay, so why don't you start, and then Joachim, and if anybody has an idea in between, please don't hesitate to raise your hand.
I have a privilege to be first, but thank you very much for for that, and excuse me for colleague.
And also, if you want to comment on anything that Joachim said, please go ahead. And I mean, if there's an aspect you want to pick up, but also start with answering questions.
Maybe I use your suggestion, but from the different point of view. Before answering for your question, I try to maybe write the general picture. We don't believe so much for enforcing regulatory in Europe if we think about antitrust framework. We don't have time. We rather need to organize like entrepreneurships and governmental agency or governments also in very quick way. For, of course, the European policy of, for example, creating productivity and well-being our region. Because of that, we are very much support the digital single market second version or second view or plus on what you like, but not like to cancel barriers. Because that step rather we did, but how to empower and center of excellence our assets, our funds, European funds, and how to maybe create the special network between European funds, bank, cross-borderly, to create the coordinated network which will support the entrepreneurs. Why we think on this way? Because the value of European economy is about $70 billion. American, $19 billion. It's the difference rather nothing, yes. And the problem is only one: how we cooperate, how do we coordinate the resources, funds, and finally the people. And even if we take a step back to the Buenos Aires WTO agenda. That was 1 year ago, like that. That was completely bankruptcy, and no, any of members could ask other members to create a very offensive digital agenda to create the trans-border and global framework, for example, if we think about competition or antitrust rules. And because of that, we rather don't believe for quick results. And because of that, we rather focus on how to build the ecosystem. And if for trying to answer for your question, of course, we are not so. We are a big country, but our productivity maybe it's not so big. We try to establish ecosystem and how the government could support the SMEs, and SMEs is special aim of us. We rather in our policy think about SMEs and how to could empower and arm SMEs in front of other companies bigger, but we of course are very interested about knowledge. And if some international company could invest in our country and create the ecosystem to create the knowledge among of big giants, for example, and SMEs, that is very good. That is very welcome. Now we try to conclude the Polish strategy of artificial intelligence. It could be very internal thinking, but also we try to find the links to the coordinated plan established by European Union, which we found very well. That is, from our perspective, second precedence. First precedence was free flow of data. Second is coordinated plan for artificial intelligence. Why? Because finally, the many agencies, many countries decided to create a framework of coordination from many levels: funds, skills, business and development, of course, yes, researcher development. And the only one question is about education, because for example, Chinese companies and United States and others came to Europe, not only Poland, Ireland, for well-skilled engineers, well-skilled people. And what we have in Europe, we have a very critical mind, critical thinking. We have a special possibility to think on a very strategic level, very on a very intuitive level, yes, and way, and because of that, this is a gold. We need to keep that gold, especially in the SMEs. Yes, and our program, it is my idea, which will be very focused how to keep that talents in the SMEs and create the possibility for SMEs to develop the talents first, results second, and finally to scale the results like through the, for example, if it's algorithmic or artificial intelligence or other technology. I'm very happy about mentioning the Internet of Things, because this is the eyes of exchanging data and knowledge. And if we think about the platformization, the economy of platforms, this is very important. And Europe has a problem, because we have a internet, closed internet in China, closed in Russia, and very open internet belonged to the United States, but living in the European Union, yes. And because of that, we need to create some network, that give us results to Europe, not general for Chinese companies, Russian companies here, and United States companies here, because the additional value coming from our market goes abroad anywhere, yes. And this is a question about virtualization. For example, the neighbors of Poland, it's Japan and Australia, not Germany and Russia, if we think from the digital space, from the internet, yes. And this is a new solution, new possibility, yes. But in the same moment, we have a situation that the tax land is virtualized also, and we need to have a question, put question on the table. What about digital tax? Of course, also, yeah. This this is a question about sources, how to finance our rethinking industrial policy.
Thank you. Joachim.
So I've been confronted with this question of consolidation. I mean, yes, so Vodafone we're the most pan-European of all operators. We're the most globalized of all operators in the world on top of it, but for sure we are the pan-European provider through our footprint. The reality, however, and that's what I've been confronted with these questions many times. I mean, I don't see that a cross-border merger would raise a lot of concerns by anyone. However, there's not a business case for it. The reason why there's not a business case for it is because regulation is national. It's as simple as that. So if Europe really wanted cross-border mergers, it would figure out how to create a business case for actually running in multiple territories. I mean, Vodafone runs its business in multiple territories in Europe. We know for a fact, because we always look for the possibility of scale, that there is none. We can do it in shared services, which is basically back office functions. And my God, if you can't do it in shared services, what can you do it for? But in the way that you run your business, in the way that you actually allocate your capital, to change the profile of the capital expenditure, which is really at the heart of scale economies, i.e. you get a different way of producing what is then your final product. We don't have that. And so, I often compare it with, for example, the consolidation within the car industry, then the development of common platforms for when they develop new models that goes beyond pure ownership on top of it. We have nothing of that. And there's a very simple reason. Policymakers have not viewed that there's a need for an internal market, and therefore there's no need for scale, and therefore there is no business case to actually do cross-border mergers. It's as simple as that. We would love if there was a business case. Now, very good that it was mentioned, the free flow of data. This is one of the areas where we thought it was very, very good progress under the DSM. And in general, of course, we have been very strong supporters of DSM. We want more as opposed to less Europe. And I think as we move forward, particularly as we understand the M10 world and what is at stake in Europe's competitiveness against China and the United States, which was also referred to here, that Europe needs to take a lead in something. We need to fix this, and we need to fix it very, very quick. I would say, however, on IoT, we are actually the leader. I mean, this is not an area where Europe has lost. We have lost in many other areas, but this is an area where we haven't lost yet. But it builds on the presumption that we put in place a framework now that addresses the fragmentation of the market, that makes sure that we have proper technological neutrality, because frankly, all of the regulations that I said that hampering scale in Europe is if it's SIM-based. If you do Wi-Fi, you can do n'importe quoi. You don't even have to build in security. You don't have to provide an illegal intercept. So all the rules that apply if it's connected with a SIM does not apply for the same like product, which is a like product concept, if it uses a different technology. So Europe really needs to figure out the concept of technological neutrality. And unfortunately, the trends that we've seen within the Commission, mostly recently around connected cars, has not been appropriate, because the Commission is proposing basically a Wi-Fi, unique single-use Wi-Fi solution for a future connected car in Europe, compared to the US and China that has opted for a SIM-based solution. Actually, we don't even care, as long as it's technologically neutral. Put us on par, allow us to compete, let the market decide. On the operating systems, I'll make a more generic point, to be honest. We did argue, as part of the discussions of the platform to business regulation, that operating systems and the way that operating system interacts with the App Store is a critical part to understand how platforms may exert inappropriate bargaining power. There is a hook in it, in the outcome of the platform to business regulation, but I think for the 18-month review period that we now have, including the observatory and the monitoring, it's going to be important to look more closely at this issue. I think bottom line, I've been quite criticized, and Vodafone's been quite criticized by some players for having stuck its neck out and actually argued for a platform to business regulation. Let me just be very clear on one thing. Some 10 years ago, there was a big discussion around operators being gatekeepers, because the fundamental question here is, if you're a gatekeeper, you have two fundamental principal obligations. One is duty to deal, and the second one is duty to care. And these two basic principles needs to be enshrined somehow. So in Europe, long time ago when Europe started thinking about operators as being the gatekeepers to people's access to internet, Europe imposed net neutrality rules. So my argument has always been, well, I'm quite used to this now. It works fine. We are not even questioning net neutrality rules from the principle. Sometimes the implementation is not appropriate, particularly in a 5G world. It's not going to work the way it's interpreted right now. However, the principle of duty of care and duty to deal is logical if you're a gatekeeper. Then you just look at the value chain, and it just happens that the gatekeeping role has shifted. And therefore, you just have to update your understanding of who is now exercising gatekeeping capabilities. And I think this is a logical approach that Europe took with respect to us as an industry, and therefore you just need to understand that the goalpost has shifted. Someone else is holding the pole with respect to the gatekeeping, and then you make sure that the way you craft legislation covers all forms of gatekeeping in this new value chain. So I think that's, from us, why we also ended up in don't thinking that our position was particularly controversial, although actually, to be honest, a lot of people criticized us for being so vocal on this. Final point on warning shots. We always talk about what industrial policy should be. Let me say a little bit about what it shouldn't be. One of our concerns in Vodafone is, of course, in a post-Euro crisis, post-Brexit world, we could start experimenting too much. And one of the experimentations we see within our sector is the tendency for remonopolization. So I'm really worried about ideas floating around of maybe it's a good idea to, instead of actually doing our homework and set the regulations right, let's do a quick fix in the form of remonopolizing parts of either the network or some of the value addition services on top of it. I think this would be a disaster for Europe. There's absolutely no historical evidence of monopolies being innovative. So that's one area where I'm really concerned. The other one is when we look at how Europe will approach this, the role of the state in general needs to be discussed. And of course, Europe has a different tradition than, and this has been a long discussion in OECD about whether state ownership per se is a problem. I think park the issue of ownership. It's not about the ownership issue. It is actually about whether we think whether the state is an active player into the marketplace or not, or whether it should set the conditions right. And the conditions can be very intrusive, including to address behaviors that led to excessive lending or excessive borrowing in the case of a financial crisis. So there's no problem actually saying maybe we need to set the rules tougher, but focus on the conditions to actually do business as opposed to now reinterpreting the role of the state to enter into the marketplace. And that's what I'm quite worried about as two sort of concerns as Europe look forward on industrial policy.
Well, thanks a lot. I think all of these points could be and will be discussed for many, many more hours. Thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts and your insights. It was, I think, a fruitful lunch debate, and now we go for the real lunch outside. Thank you.